The use of terms like red flag nowadays are just such a go-to in situations that they're not warranted, and I think it's so
Totally.
damaging. It's so damaging, like, and it drives me crazy to hear people when they sort of say, "Oh, he's got so many red flags." Like we all do. I haven't met a single human being that isn't littered with red flags. It's just whether or not their red flags matches your red flags, and you can work well with them. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, yeah, you should bring out the parts of the person that you love the most, the real darker parts of them. You should be able to bring them out because it's in that love that you have the strength then to work through them.
Hi, I'm Kalie and this is Just Lookin Out. Today's episode is a little different. It's quieter, heavier, but also, if we do this right, deeply human. We're talking about how our online lives are shaping our mental health, why so many men are struggling to be vulnerable, and how shame, especially in digital spaces, can become dangerous when it's carried alone. My guest today understands this not just clinically, but personally. Please welcome Liam Wakefield, a trauma and psychology specialist who started his practice after he completed his military service and has come to be a highly sought after voice on the topic of mental health. Liam, welcome to Just Looking Out.
Katie, thank you for having me on here.
Liam, can you tell us a little bit about your experience in this space and just kind of start us off with just a little bit about you and how you came to be so well versed in the trauma and psychology, um, specifically around military vets and what you did with the National Health Service therapy, et cetera?
Yeah, okay. So for me, it really started out, I guess my awareness to this started out when I got diagnosed with a condition in the military and was told I was being medically retired. I had kind of pinned a lot of my life and future on just being a serviceman, and that's where I felt that I was most suited. And I think the important thing there is I felt that that's where I belong because given the childhood I'd had, it kind of shaped me into not feeling that I belonged anywhere else. So finding something difficult to sort of exist within become a real source of strength for me. So then to be told I was being medically retired because I couldn't be that anymore,
Mm.
it really broke down a lot of parts, or at least perceptions and perspectives of myself in there. And I recognized that after hitting a particularly difficult point in life where I didn't want to move forward with my own life, I then obviously having two children at that point, very young children, had to find some source of grounding. And I think it began in a level of self inquiry, really trying to understand myself. And I was very fortunate to have a lot of help through the military, through mental health, as well as physical rehabilitation, and working with some just incredible professionals in their own fields. It really inspired me to sort of dig a little deeper within myself. And I guess I challenged a lot of what I was facing, and trying to understand myself amongst that really gave me some tools to carve a path and move forward. And then there I got a disabled veteran scholarship, and sort of went on my own path of understanding it from an academic perspective, but then also using the lived experience to really carve out my own practice. And I was fortunate enough to work over in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, doing some suicide prevention. And I came back and worked at the NHS for a period of time before getting into lecturing. I was doing a lot of lecturing at the colleges around psychotherapy and counselling, and then opening up my own private practice, which it's been one of the most incredible steps forward within my own life in really kind of trusting myself and believing in myself and what I could do, having been given so many you know limits to my ability to do things, given the condition I was facing, and right the way back to childhood, limiting beliefs from what people had told me and what I could never become. And yeah, the journey had so many evolutions within that. But I think one of the most prominent points for there was I'd lost 9 friends to PTSD, well, PTSD related incidents that led to suicide. And I think you only need one to really look at life and think what's happened there. But
Mm.
to see it happen again and again and again really starts to beg the question is what can be done and what can be changed to try and make a bit of a difference here, if not to a wider community, at least the people that you have closest to you. That was a big thing for me to really lean into that for myself and for others. And I think this whole thing has been a journey. The duality of this journey has been not just for everybody else, but to really understand myself in this too. So there's been a huge level of self exploration, which I have enacted out in what I've done. And I think it's been helpful for people that I've worked with as well as people that are close to me.
Well, I know you're in the UK, but I wish I could give you like a giant hug after that intro. And I can feel my own heart like just really going out to you. So before we just dive deeper into this, I want to gently just let our listeners know that today's episode is really heavy and it includes discussions of suicide, trauma, online exploitation, bullying. So if at any point people that are listening need support, whether you're in the US, you can call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can also contact SAM HSA by texting Talk With Us to 66746 or calling 1-800-985-5990. And if you're listening outside the US, we'll share additional resources at the end of the episode. I just think it's really important to take a pause there because a lot of my episodes aren't so heavy, but I think this one is exceptionally important, especially as we round out the year to understand the gravity of just what's going on in the world as it pertains to mental health and what people are struggling with, and just understanding that this is a global phenomenon that we all need to be aware of and take note that, it might not be happening to you, but it could easily be happening to your friend or neighbor. So, Liam, I'd love to start not with what you do, but who you were. You kind of mentioned it a little bit, your childhood. You referenced it a few
Mm.
times when you were telling me about, high level, what it is that led you to this space. Can you talk to me a little bit about just being a kid and maybe why you didn't feel like you were so accepted or had a group for you, and why the military felt so grounding in that way?
Yeah. Again, like just to caveat what you said there with the heaviness of this, I know I can appreciate that these subjects are heavy, but they're so important to look at. And it's not that everybody has had some of the bigger T traumas in life, but everybody has had some experience of something that shaped who they are. And I don't believe there's any level that is worse than anyone else. It's all subjective. So I know my story at times can feel heavy, but there's things to relate, I think, for everybody in the sense that we can all face suffering to the degree in which we experience life. And for me, this has been a big source of connecting with people as well. And whether it's, and then we'll talk through with the story side of things, is I've had a lot of different, you know, a lot of different strings to my bow in the life, because I've always been on some kind of journey of trying to understand things at a different level. And it does all come back to the childhood. And for me, at childhood, my sister and I were left by our mum at a very young age. And I was fortunate to have a phenomenal father who, did his best to sort of hold us in a space that we could at least be children for a brief period of time. But we had faced a pretty tough childhood in that respect. And there were things that had gone on in there, within abuse and abandonment, that really did create a lot of fear. We were we were children that carried fear deeply in us, in the things that we had done and the way we lived. And which is such an important thing for children, is you lose so much of the element of play when you have to exist in a space that's so filled with fear. And that transferred into many of the years that followed and the many things that we did. So by the time I'd hit teenage years, as well as just having the teenage angst and the hormones, I had this gaping like motherhood wound that
Hmm.
existed there. That was, turned me volatile. It made it really hard to just love myself. And I think that in turn, over many years, until relatively recently, created a real toughness that made it almost unable to accept being loved, because I couldn't love myself at all. And I think this transcended through so many iterations of who I was as a man, and who I was as a teenager, and who I was as a boy, right the way back. And despite having an immensely fantastic father who was so soft and connecting. He was just wonderful. But at the same time, I think the lack of what I experienced as a childhood in connection and communication and love, just it created a lot of pain and a lot of what I would rather not use as damage, but it was damage. It was fractures. It fractured parts of me in ways that shaped pretty tough exteriors going forward. And that's why it becomes so suitable for service. Because my teenage years, from about 13 to 18, I was going to be a rock star. I had long black hair, cowboy boots, and leather trousers, and but I lent into the pain. Yeah, I know, right? The pain of what existed there. So
Well, wait, was it giving like Marilyn Manson? Or that's what I
no,
have in my head.
no, that's think more Guns N' Roses in the
Okay.
1980s.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to think that most of the images are redacted from online. So
One can only hope, but
yeah,
I'm gonna absolutely need to see a picture. I'm sorry. Like that was just so moving what you said earlier, and sometimes it's good to have a little comedic relief there.
yeah.
So thank
You
you for making
gotta.
us giggle.
That's it. I had to line it up. It'd be a little bit too heavy, wasn't it? But no, I think it's important to notice that as well, though, because at the end of the day, I went into that world, with it was just pure rebellion. I was in such a rebellious stage, and music was such a channel to channel my hurt and channel that pain and channel that aggression. And it worked beautifully until it became incredibly toxic. And I just I remember my dad being so distraught in thinking I'm going to lose my son to drink and drugs and
Mm.
violent behavior, because that was the world I was in. And, it wasn't who I was. I was very much still that really hurt, scared little boy, and he could see that. And I think it created such a damaging thing to such a beautiful relationship that I've had with my dad my entire life, which, we managed to mend. And I did it by joining the army. I remember we'd got given a record contract as well, and we'd got everything that I'd wanted in music to the step forward into something great. And I ended up shaving my head and joining the army because I thought it was the only way I could escape what was clearly a self-destructive act. And the army seemed so suited for me because it was hard and it was hurt. Like, it hurt. It was tough. It wasn't easy. I joined the infantry, and I wanted to just do the hardest thing I could do in that, just to, again, reflectively, when I look back on it, I thought I was doing it from a place of pride, but I actually think I was doing it also from a place of self-destruction. There's a level of self-flagellation in putting yourself through something that is just abhorrently painful, for the pretense that you can mask it as I'm doing something good. But realistically, again, there was that angsty teenager that just wanted to hurt. I wanted to feel. I wanted to feel something, and I didn't know how to feel or navigate feelings. And the army provided a wonderful platform to do that.
What was the defining moment where you knew you needed to make a change?
From the teenage years into shaving the head, that luscious black hair off, and putting the cowboy boots aside. Yeah, I think I was incredibly drunk, and we'd done some gigs, and that it just disgustingly, like, not in a good place. And again, I even use the word disgustingly, and I shouldn't, in the sense that I'm denigrating that version of me, which I need more compassion for, but it was bad. And I think, and a friend had locked me in our rehearsal space, and I freaked out. I freaked out because he'd locked me in there, and they'd all gone to bed, and I ended up smashing the place to pieces. But what was coming out now, when I look at it reflectively, there was a point in my childhood when I was locked in a space which was incredibly vulnerable and threatening to me, at like a 5-year-old. So this brought out, again, the worst of that. And I remember going home, and I remember the guitarist, or the drummer and the bass guitarist's dad coming over, like sort of 17 years old, and I smashed a metronome of his, which was really old, and it was really meant something to him, and he had built our space for us, and it was a disappointment in his face, and he was like, "Don't come around here again," like that. And I was like, "Wow, okay, I've really hurt somebody by my actions," But my actions were just reactive to the fear I was feeling, but I'd hurt somebody, not physically but emotionally. And I think that just destroyed me because that's not who I ever thought I was and never wanted to be. And I think it was a real wake up call that if I don't change, I'm going to hurt more people. And that's not acceptable.
Yeah, and I think what's so extraordinary to me with your story is that instead of shutting down or turning away from that pain, one, you recognized it, right? You were aware of it. Um, you knew that you needed to do something drastic in order to change the course of your own life, but also you took it a step further when you left the military to how do I stop this from happening again, or how do I
Mm,
stop this from happening to other people, which I just think is so profoundly amazing in terms of just your ability as a human to see that and help others. So thank you so much
mm,
for sharing your story. I know that it's never easy, but I think it's important to stress that if anybody is that is feeling these kinds of things or struggling with mental health and they're listening to this right now, like you've been at the what is it fair to say? Like you've been at the depths of it. I mean, and clawed your way
mm.
out and it's possible.
Yeah, it absolutely is possible. And I think that what's key to note here as well is it's not that you only have, you don't only hit it once. I think I've hit the bottom a few times, and you every time you can claw out of this, you can climb out of this, you can learn what it's like to be there, and the version of you that exists at the bottom of there, I think, is an important thing to recognize because you'll always hit a low moment. Like you fluctuate through life. We oscillate between these states of hyperarousal and hypoarousal regularly. And I think it's important to understand what versions of ourselves we meet in those places. And I think when we hit a time that is particularly difficult, because it doesn't take much, it really doesn't take much. I went from what I thought was a good life. I was married with two kids. They were very young kids. I had the dreams of where I wanted to go in the military with special forces. I was the fittest guy. I thought at that point I'd never been fitter, and I thought it was all going great. And within 6 months, my entire life had crashed and fallen out, and everything had fallen apart, and I was alone. Found myself not long after that in a council house flat on my own with nothing in it, like on the way out of the military, and that was it. And it was back at rock bottom, staring at the council estate I'd grown up in, thinking, how have I ended up here? Like, how has this happened? And it can so quickly get there.
Can you walk us through a little bit about why you ended up ending your military career or why it had to end?
Yeah, so I had pain in my eyes, and I was boxing for my unit at the time, and just put it down to not being a very good boxer. And I was like, oh, well, okay, but then it wouldn't go, and I was like, okay, I was really starting to struggle with that pain, and I went and had some scans, and they said, look, there's lumps at the back of your eyes. We need to get them investigated further. And I thought, I'm not doing that. I said, the moment I do that, that's it. The military are going to jump on this, and I'm going to be stuffed. That would be my career over. At this point, I was like 9.5 years in, so I wanted to do the full 24. We were sorted. In the military, you get a military house, and we had a nice, like, 3-bedroom property in the New Forest in England. So for anyone not listening, it's just this beautiful place in England. And I thought, well, I don't want to lose all of this. And the job I was doing was great, and the direction I was going was fantastic. So I didn't want to screw that up by voicing my health concerns. So I left it. I left it for about a year, and it got worse and worse. And other parts of my body started to go. Pain started to appear in all sorts of places. And I thought, I'm not in a good way. And so I went and got the scans, and I ended up getting diagnosed with a rare genetic condition called pseudoxanthoma elasticum, which is a mouthful. And yeah, they said I was losing my eyesight. Um, and they said I was going to be unable to continue being a soldier, and they were going to have to medically retire me. And I remember getting the conversation, and I was sat there, and it was one of those moments of thinking, come on, how much do you want to throw at somebody? And I was just like, my life just bottomed out. And they said, look, you're never going to be able to work again, and you're never going to be able to train again. And they just pulled my life apart. And I know a lot of them are doing it from the perspective of fear because they didn't know much about the condition. So they just kind of jump on it quick as anything and say, just don't do anything. Um, and yeah, I watched my life slowly erode in that space of time. And I watched my mental health erode. And it got worse and worse. And the pain, obviously, from a psychogenic perspective, the moment my mental health fell apart, the pain went up. And yeah, I was just living in this space of chronic pain, and that then had a huge impact on the marriage, as well as my realization that I was not in the place I wanted to be with the person I wanted to be with, and I just retreated and wanted to be alone. And it was in that moment that again I found in the darkest corners of myself the worst of me, and that came out.
How did you pull yourself out?
Honestly, it got to the point of a transition from passive suicidality to active. And I had a moment where I went to end everything. And through drinking far too much and botching it completely up, I was then faced with the fact of I've just got that far of ending my life and having two small kids and thinking, what would I have done to them if that had gone through and that had worked? And it was such a wake up call, having known as well that 9 of my friends had committed suicide through PTSD, or suicide from PTSD, that I was about to be another number on another sheet somewhere, another product of a war that most people now don't even have any recollection of. And it was a big thing. It was a whole, like, my pain was just non-existent and so kept deeply within myself that no one really knew what was going on. And I think that was the big wake up call for me, was like, I need to understand this. And if I can understand it in me, then maybe I can understand it in others. And if I can understand it in them, then maybe I can help. And that for me was a big contributor to the journey I had to get onto, was because there had to be a reason that I could go through everything that I went through from childhood, through the teenage years, through the military, then through getting diagnosed, to then separation and suicide, to then be in a place where I could rebuild, to then help others. Otherwise, what's it all for?
I'm very glad that you botched that that up.
Thank you.
So, yes, we're very thankful that that worked out in that way. Obviously, like, that was just such a defining, pivotal moment for you, and you had these precious little ones and just all the enormous emotions that come with all of that. How
Mm.
did you decide that, "You know what? I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna study this and learn what it is that I'm actually experiencing, both mentally, psychologically." What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, it was. There's such a poignant moment in that that stands out above everything else, and it was I'd spent a month living at a pain rehabilitation facility. It's called Stanford Hall, where a lot of disabled veterans and wounded soldiers go for rehabilitation. And I was there for chronic pain. And I was with this lady. She was a major. She was far higher ranked than I was, and but we connected. We got on really well, and she there was something about her that held quite a maternal figure, and we really bonded. And every morning we'd have coffee, and then we'd meet in the evening and have dinner. And through the day, we'd do our various therapies and rehabilitation. We'd do yoga and different. Would see a number of therapists and lots of different things. It was great. It was a wonderful month and difficult in its own right, but it wasn't. And I can be contentious and I can be a know-it-all sometimes, I guess. And I think that come out in that environment where I'd sit opposite somebody and we'd be talking about it, and I'd think, okay, right, I'm going to go and read a book about that and come back tomorrow, and then regurgitate that back to them. But it was doing me no favor at all, because it was blocking my own growth and my own change and my own vulnerability. But then it was a conversation with this lady that she said at the end, she was like, thank you. And I said, what for? And she was like, well, all this stuff's been fine, but it's our conversations we've had that have saved my life. And she was like, and I don't think I would have done that without you. So, I think that's what you should be doing in life. And at that point, just to note on that, is I was a big guy. I was I thought I was all strength physically. I didn't. Going through school, I was always told I was stupid. I didn't do well. I dropped out of school. Early on, I had to redo a lot of my education in the military. But because I was, brought up in a space of such chaotic disorganization, my ability to focus and learn was just non-existent until I kind of had my own space in my own head that I could do that. So I never even thought of it as a pursuit in regards to learning something. I just used my physicality as a way to move forward. So to have somebody say, "Look, it doesn't matter that your body's broken. Your mind is brilliant in doing this. So you should do this." And that really sparked something for me of going, okay, so talking works. I'm good at talking, and it kind of set me on a path to go, well, how do I do that? How do I do more of that? And so I just started to look into it that way and did some courses and then did some, went to school and relearn and sort of really put everything into really trying to cultivate an ability to articulate myself. Because again, I remember as a kid, I always had it in my head as what I wanted to say, but I couldn't articulate myself. The moment it got to my lips, it just disappeared and fear stopped any ability to do it. And I think being able to then go back and learn how to apply a language to how I was feeling then become such a point of, it's like an aha moment of going, right, I get it, right? I get what this is. Like I can articulate this, which comes into a lot of what I practice now with my patients is giving them a language or giving them a map to navigate themselves with the right and appropriate language in which they can then describe that. Because the moment you can articulate how you feel, everything starts to change. And that's the first thing that we tend to lose when we get reactive or we hit that space of, that fear center really triggers. We lose our ability to articulate ourselves, or at least coherently.
So tell us and help us understand, like, what's the first step in being able to articulate how it is we're feeling and identifying that we're in a bad space?
Yeah, I mean, first is it's awareness. One of the biggest things is really getting to see how we're responding in situations like that. I think even in my adult form as a psychotherapist and thinking I have a good understanding of it, I will still get called out by my partner for saying something that I haven't thought through properly or thought about at enough level of awareness. And it could be something so related to my past that it's innate and it just seems so natural. But then it's when somebody says, "Oh, hey, by the way, do you recognize you're doing this thing?" And this is why talk therapy is fantastic, so people can have an opportunity to voice and have it come back to them without judgment from a perspective of, "Oh, that doesn't sound good," or "That's not that isn't how you think it should be sounding or responding to something." And it's about being able to take a pause within ourselves before we make judgments or say things within the moment. Because ultimately, we are guided and governed by the defense mechanisms we have. So if you've grown up in an environment where your reactivity is to a threat which is dangerous or harmful, then the level of volatility that will come with that can be really damaging to a relationship or a friendship or, a communicative environment in which doesn't warrant that. This is, you can say something that's completely left field and unexpected, but it's a defense mechanism stepping in. So when I work with people, it's about navigating the parts of that person to recognize, well, what parts are coming up in what situations here, and how can you learn to better dialogue those parts so that it doesn't take over and come out in a situation that leaves you in more of a dire conversation than it needs to.
I mean, it sounds so logical when you hear it being put out like that. I think that actually doing it and the ability to be aware is so much more difficult, right? It almost,
Yeah.
like you just mentioned, somebody calling it out for you. Um, I sometimes had these, like, almost moments where I, like, reflect on, like, how I reacted, and it's not how I want to be or live my life, etcetera. So then, how do you, I guess, how are you able to have your own self-awareness rather than somebody else calling it out for you?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it has to. generate from the self, right? So it has to be within you. I mean, it's wonderful when people do call it out, or it's not. It's quite uncomfortable, but it's great. It's great to have people
It
that
might not be
champion
great
that.
in the moment, but it like
Yeah,
it is a reflective period for sure.
yeah. In the long run, it works out better. But
Yeah.
I think sitting with yourself and understanding truly what works and what doesn't work for you, and understanding why. I mean, you don't have to take too long before you notice things that start to bother you and you notice response. If you just take a moment to sit with the inner dialogue that you've got going on, it doesn't take long before you recognize voices within that dialogue that you wouldn't want to say out loud, or you'd rather it not be heard by somebody. So then if you take away the veil in which sits between it being in your head and it being said out loud, this is where we recognize reactivity patterns. So if you have a pattern of getting pretty fired up in an argument, but you've got an inner dialogue that can be pretty denigrating and put somebody down, then you can pretty much assure that there'll be a point in which that's going to spill out in certain environments, and that's going to really cause a lot of harm. Same way as when we look at relationships, when somebody can, to some degree, gaslight or be pretty manipulative, and oftentimes it's not a conscious act. These are unconscious processes that have been so fixed within how they've been brought up and their learned behaviors and their defense mechanisms that it becomes innate. So being able to sit with the inner dialogue and recognizing, well, how do you voice things to yourself, and how do you voice things internally about other people? Because if that's not good, and if you haven't got a congruent and you know softer approach in your inner dialogue, then your reflections in the difficult times are going to be more aligned with that. It's going to create a lot more conflict externally.
Okay, so on a human level, this is a lot, and I'm sure you're having these kinds of conversations all day, every day. So, how do you, Liam Wakefield, decompress after holding in your own pain, hearing other people's pain? What are you doing to rid yourself of some of that energy?
Well, it's a really good question because I've again, I'm a workaholic to some degree, and I think everyone around me has been very lovely in voicing how they feel about taking time, because I haven't taken
They've
enough.
let you know. Uh huh.
They've let me know. They've let me know, and I'm so glad that they have, because again, it's recognizing patterns, and I recognized in a pattern with myself is even in doing the good thing, I've turned it into something that has to be a trajectory. And somebody said a great line to me the other day, and they said it's compulsion, not compassion. And it really struck me in thinking, oh my goodness, I am acting out of compulsion, not compassion, when I thought I'm just trying to help people. So yeah, it took a big swing at me, and I had to kind of sit with going, okay, well, how can I decompress? How do I? Because ultimately, this does all stack up, and I've had probably the worst bout of health this year in having a degenerative health condition than I have in all the other years since being diagnosed. And that the big part of that is because I've been working so hard at cultivating what I'm doing that I haven't actually applied time to find peace and find some measure of margin within my days. And I think for me, the things I love the most, I've just spent the most incredible Christmas with my kids and partner and and friends, and all of a sudden the stress just dropped, and that playfulness, that this year has been one of the first years I've experienced playfulness to the level of which I never got to as a kid. And it was such a beautiful thing to be able to share time with friends and loved ones, and connect on a level that felt so real. And that's because there was time created in there to do that. And it got really busy because work was going really well. And when as you can imagine for yourself, when you're doing something that then builds up a level of attention as well as appreciation for your ability to do what you do, it's exciting. And you get so sucked into it that you then just want to do that all the time. But being able to take a step back, like I have recently, and looking at the people I love the most and thinking, I want to spend more time with them without having this hat on of this guy who will read lots of books and talk to lots of people, and just being able to put that, like, take that off and just be silly, just be just calm. And the kids have been the biggest influence recently. And again, my partner as well. And just go and just have fun. You have fun. Stop being everything's so serious. And I think just taking a moment to just be playful has been the biggest antidote to pressure that had been building up. And I think that in this kind of environment and this kind of work environment, it really can stack up quite quick.
I love that so much. It's like the moments that I'm with my daughter and she's laughing, like that belly laugh of a kid. It reminds you that like pure joy and happiness is possible with you as an adult
Yeah.
too, and to like lean into those moments because sometimes, and very much like you, I can turn work into a compulsion, and it
Mm,
can be, just it can be something that overtakes my life when in reality it's not the most important thing. And so I
yeah.
love that you said the playfulness because it actually reminds you what is the most important thing, and that's spending time with your family or your friends or your partner. And that coincidentally is the quality of your relationships, which then, dictate how long we live and how happy we
Yeah.
are. So, that was as like much as we all know that in our head to actually hear the word playfulness and stop and have a lighthearted moment. Sometimes it's just a good reminder.
Yeah. And that we need these reminders. And children are great for giving those reminders. But even if you don't have children and you're not in an environment where you have many people, there is playfulness that can happen in all sorts of things. It's just, we bought roller skates for Christmas, like for all of us. And it's like we assign so much to it being child behavior or childish things to do. But there's only the point in which we limit it as adults because we feel silly doing it. But when we can relinquish embarrassment because we don't want to be seen as being silly and playful, we give ourselves an opportunity to really tap into parts of ourselves that we've forgotten, or in my case, never got to be. And I think it's a wonderful thing to start tapping into that and thinking, wow, this is great. And it's infectious when you see somebody really enjoying the art of play. It's wonderful to see. I know in England we're rife with this absolute abhorrent thing of just being embarrassed for everything we do. We say sorry at absolutely everything. We're so stiff in everything that we do. And I think it's so nice to see someone just relax and just be silly. And when you see it, it's magical. And I think it's something I know next year, well, this coming year, is what I really want to lean into is that creativity and that play. And like say, I'm fortunate to have two children that remind me of that every time.
I love that. I think it's funny. I actually got my daughter, or excuse me, Santa got my daughter rollerblades, and
Yeah.
then said, "Well, you need to get some." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Mommy hasn't rollerbladed since her days in Miami." And then I'm thinking back to like when I used to think I was so badass and sexy, like in Miami, South Beach, like rollerblading. And so I was like, you know
Yeah.
what? I'm gonna buy them. I'm gonna get it, and I'm gonna wear the elbow pads because, I mean, God knows I'm gonna fall, and
Yeah.
so we're just gonna set out together, just rollerblading around Chicago, I guess, this summer.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's incredible. And you feel
Awesome.
so good for doing it as well.
I
With
know.
that moment of, yeah.
I'll report back, but, definitely need to, like, put some grease on these, like, my knees and stuff. Okay, I like that we had that little kind of reprieve, but this is something that I do think that we need to talk about, and something that scares a lot of parents, and quietly devastates a lot of young boys, and that's the topic of sextortion. For listeners who might not know what that word means, sextortion is when scammers use fake profiles on social media or gaming platforms to coerce explicit images of said, child and then threaten exposure. It's terrible. I think I read that Thorne's 2025 research shows that 20% of teens nowadays have experienced some level of sextortion. So, what happens psychologically within the human nervous system when shame of that magnitude makes someone feel like they no longer belong? Whether that's a soldier or being a teenage boy, can you help break that down for us?
Yeah. Well, as within the human condition, our very existence is predicated on belonging. When you remove belonging, you remove everything. This isolation is an absolute killer. I mean, yes, people can adapt to some degree, but by and large, the majority of us are wired to belong and to connect. So when these things happen, whether it's being in the military and leaving the military, or whether it is being in an environment where you're ostracized or manipulated or coerced into something that threatens your very existence amongst your peers and amongst others, it is destructive, completely destructive. And I think what it does psychologically is it puts you in a state of threat and then perpetual threat. And what it does then is it breaks down the need for isolation, and almost in the ways that sometimes animals disappear to go and die. Something also happens within the psyche that removes itself from association in order to sort of detach and then deconstruct itself. And this is when behaviors become so absent to the norm for the person. You can see it within children, and I've witnessed this more so within teenagers, that when I was at the college that had been exposed to situations like this. And that was a huge thing you notice, is this change in demeanor. And over a very short amount of time, this withdrawal from community and others. And then ultimately, the worst, obviously, that nobody wants to happen. And that is when they end up with nothing and this level of hopelessness. This is that can then lead to suicide. And it's a terrifying place to be. And I think whether it is from that level of sexploitation where they're being used and manipulated into an environment in which they're exposing vulnerable parts of themselves, both physically and mentally, emotionally, it really is, for a younger generation now where so much of their life is online and it is in an environment in which they connect and they communicate, and it's very hard to not be in an environment like that. So being coerced and pulled and manipulated into something threatening, as you've read out, it's shown in the numbers, right? The fear is that this doesn't seem to be something that's going to go away. If not, it's something that's going to grow, because more and more of our lives are going to be tied to an online environment.
One of the things that you said, and I just learned this, to be honest with you, you said led to suicide and not the word commit suicide. And I just want everybody listening to understand that that's not common vernacular anymore. We don't say commit
Yeah.
suicide because suicide is not a crime.
Hmm.
We use words like what you just said, died by suicide or completed suicide, led by suicide, recognizing that it very much is a mental health crisis that led to this tragic incident. So, thank you for teaching us that as well. So, for parents listening, I know this is a really just god awful topic. It's downright terrifying, especially I have a 7-year-old daughter. Liam, you have little ones too. There's panic and anger and fear. Um, and it's just kind of like when something like this happens, what are the first things parents should do or can do to let their kids know that they're there for them, that they are going to try to help? Like, what do we do as adults in a situation where we don't even understand it fully ourselves?
Yeah. I think the key thing to remember with all of this is trying to start any kind of intervention way before there's even a problem. And what I mean by that is cultivating an environment where communication is open and accessible, because what happens in these environments is when there is a detachment, which is a natural thing between parents and children, there is things that happen in that space. Ultimately, there is an existential crisis within young children turning into teenagers, where they're trying to identify who they are and who they are separate from their parents. But it doesn't mean the thread needs to be cut. Ultimately, there are clashes that happen, and quite often what happens in there is the thread gets cut, and the children then become teenagers and they isolate, and then they find people that can pull them wayward to some degree. And then when things like that happen online and they don't have anybody to turn to, that's when this hopelessness sets in, and it's very hard to regain something when that hopelessness is set in. And that the passive to active ideation is then the big worrying factor there, to sort of try and preempt a lot of this, it's really trying to establish a connection from a level that they can then express vulnerability when things do get difficult on every level, because ultimately all somebody needs in these moments is somebody to turn to, because ultimately it's when somebody feels that they haven't got anyone to turn to, or they're burdening everyone around them, that they then lead to these environments where suicide becomes something that is a plausible option. When somebody can show up for their children in a way that they can hold the weight of their pain and not feel like it's a burden, and they can communicate and they can talk openly about things in a way that's not going to come back or be weaponized on them or take away their autonomy, is a big one, is the things that can be a preventative towards, the decline of a teenager's or a child's mental health. And it's something I've seen, and I didn't get it right first time with my own children. I think early on, I'd got it fairly wrong, and having to reestablish that most recently with my son, in saying it's okay, let's talk. And I had a groundbreaking moment with him the other day where I had been stressing and I had been cutting communication off, and we'd gone to get a sandwich, and I'd stressing him to give me a response to which sandwich he wanted, because the queue was getting big and people were watching, and that kind of whole thing, and it stressed him out, and he went straight into fight flight, and he froze, and he didn't know what to pick, and he chose nothing, and then it created something. But cultivating an environment where communication is key. About a few hours later, when we were back home, he came up to me and said, "Dad, can you come into the other room? I want to talk to you." And he pulled me into the other room. He said, "I just want to tell you how I feel, and you really stressed me out earlier." And it was got me, like it gut punched me, and in a beautiful way, and thinking, wow, he's expressing hurt in a way that was so genuine and authentic and vulnerable, and it shows that it can be held. And it's not to say I get it right all the time, because I did it the other day. I didn't get it right. I was too quick to respond to something that shut him down and made him feel not heard. And these are the things as parents that people need to look out for, is how often are you closing down a child's need for their space to be held? Because if you push onto them that you haven't got capacity to hold their pain because it's too stressful for you, then they won't come to you. They'll take it internally. And then when they face adversity in their life in respect to, let's say, the sexploitation, they're not going to come to anybody else, because that is such a level of exposure. They're not going to want to burden that onto anyone, because let's face it, most parents would say that is their worst nightmare. And if a child knows that that's their parents' worst nightmare, the last thing they want to do is inflict their worst nightmare onto the parents. So it's creating these environments where we have to be so careful in what we say and how we say it, that we don't close off communication between the children and ourselves as parents.
That's such good advice for, like, offline parenting. Do you have any practical tips for what parents can do with kids when it comes to online spaces and keeping them safe there?
Yeah, again, I think it's awareness. Like creating an environment where they feel that it's taboo or they got to hide what they're doing. Like sharing a space with a parent, is the only way that you can be on the same level with them. If you create an us and them identity between an online world, then they'll slip away into their world where you won't have an idea what's going on. Trying to stay present with their world and what's going on in that world is the only way that you can really stay in touch with that, which is hard because you want to be able to navigate it in a way that you're not helicopter parenting the child online, because that's just going to create a need to break away. So again, there has to come trust. Trust is such an important thing. If you create enough trust within the child, and you create enough connection with what the world that they're in and relatability to that, then they'll want to share openly, because it's something that they believe that you understand. If you create an us and them environment where it's so disconnected, they won't want to share it.
It's so interesting because, I have a girlfriend, and they actually their family went through some really tough stuff with online and safety and the adolescence, etcetera. So they were told to go buy an old school, like, 2002 computer and put it right in the center of the kitchen island, and the kids could do whatever they wanted online. But essentially, what they were doing was creating this, like, super transparent environment where what they did online, like, parents know, and, we're going to trust you to a certain extent. And it's completely shaped the way that these like 11 and 12-year-olds think about being online. Now they don't think of it as like they run upstairs and close the door really fast to do, to get onto, I don't know, whatever sites that they're getting onto. It's just like, this is me doing my homework online and my mom's, in the kitchen. I loved that so much. And it ties into what you're saying, just cultivate just such a normalcy around what it means to communicate with your kids, have a connection with your kids so that if they do run into a circumstance where they need to reach out to you, just like your son, they feel comfortable in doing that. Because I feel like there's just, I don't know what it is with the men today, and maybe you can walk us through some of the psychology, but I find that men in particular have a really hard time navigating and communicating their feelings. And do you think that it's because of this day and age, or talk to me a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, so when it comes to looking at it from the masculine sense, there is a blurred line between strength and an ability to put up with difficult things and also expressing vulnerability. And you see a lot of it online now with quite manicured vulnerability and sort of people expressing certain things, but then there is the complete diametrically opposed, like aggressive nature of somebody that's like, you just power through, you just get through things. And it's stoicism on steroids to such a degree where it brainwashes people, because ultimately, and if you look at it from let's say a mythopoetic sense, we look for the higher powers in the things that we're feeling. So we want, this is why Marvel works well with kids, because they're godlike, or they're superheroes in their strength and their ability to function and do things. And kids want to do that. They want to fly, or they want to be invisible, or they want to be able to be strong because they want to avoid the pain that they're going to feel at some points in life. And I think for young men, they cultivate this need to do that, but they do it in a way that becomes so hyper aggressive that they lose the softer touches to the human condition, which is, Carl Jung called it the anima and the animus, and it's the feminine within the masculine and the masculine within the feminine. If we find a balance within ourselves where we can be strong as young men, but we can be vulnerable enough to connect, because otherwise you just end up with such a fortitude and strength that becomes a barricade around actually expressing feelings and needs. And I was working with somebody a little while back ago who was such a lovely young guy, but he was just so aggressive and felt so unable to open that part of him. And it took a long time for him to start opening up. And he told me a story and once about going on a date, and there was a group of other guys, and he just was, but it was his tension around the others that created a situation that had become violent. But his deeper need was he wanted to just make sure she was okay when she was walking back to like where she was getting picked up. But the miscommunication around the whole environment of how he was perceiving other people and how he was perceiving himself actually created an environment that was really vulnerable and dangerous for her. And which was the opposite to what he was trying to do.
Sure, he
So I think,
freaked her out.
yeah, massively. And, and obviously it could have been even worse. It could have created an even more dangerous situation by it getting physical. And this stems a lot from his understanding of himself. He didn't realize that the tension he was holding was creating such an aggressive demeanor. And he just thought he was being, kind of mysterious and quiet, but really he was creating a lot of nervous energy that is felt. And it really is felt. You can tell a mile off when somebody is really projecting that nervous energy that becomes unpredictable and dangerous. And I think this is why it's such a need for everybody, but yes, especially young men, to really try and understand themselves, because the level of aggression that can come out in the ambiguity of understanding oneself can be really quite dangerous. And I think when young men are together and bored, they can become some of the most dangerous creatures on this planet. And I really believe that. Having been in the military and been around a load of young men that are bored, it's a dangerous environment, because ultimately people do stupid things and they do things that just don't warrant the actions that are being portrayed. And it's because there's a lack of self-awareness and there is a need to impress, and that this amplification of one-upmanship and egoic behaviors just becomes really toxic. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I think being able to sit with yourself and really understand how you feel and not try and perform in response to how other people are looking at you can change completely this generation of young men.
I have a lot of people that listen to this podcast that come on for dating advice or dating stories, etc. So for those that are listening that are dating somebody or talking to somebody that maybe are exhibiting some of the behaviors that you're talking about, the inability to communicate, be vulnerable, hyperaggression, etc. Are there things that we can do to help make the people that are having a hard time communicating feel more comfortable to communicate?
Yeah, I think it's cultivating an environment where the expression of needs can be done without heavy judgment. Because for a lot of people in these environments, they don't know how to express needs. And coming from a guy who has been in a situation where I've not known how to express my own needs, that's oftentimes what exists at the bottom of these responses and these reactivities is trying to hold space for someone enough in which they can then figure that out. And and if when you take it to the question in regards to dating, that might not always be possible. Maybe somebody's not in the position yet where they can and have the ability to express a need or learn how to express a need in that relationship. But they will over time, and it takes time. And it's not that somebody should be the training post for somebody's needs expression. It's that's not fair on somebody else to have to shoulder that. But that's not to say that they shouldn't, if they want to withstand a relationship and get to a point that it can become a strong relationship, it can be amazing. However, I think recognizing somebody's ability to express their needs, and if that's something that can be held and worked through, then yeah, that can really make a difference. But I think that's the first port of call for anything when you look at relationships and dating, because if somebody can't express their needs, then at some point in that relationship, it's going to hit a hard time.
Yeah. For me personally, like I've dated or I've been on dates with men where it's like I tried too hard to um, make them feel like they're in a safe space, and then suddenly we're in some sort of a therapy session, and I'm like, "Oh," I'm also like, so it's a fine line. It's a balance for sure of, and I also think it's a timing thing. Like people this day and age, they want to move so fast and have instant gratification on everything, but the willingness and to open up to somebody that is just inherently takes a little bit of time with trust and just like the organic, you know, nurturing of a relationship. So, do you have any thoughts around that as well?
Yeah, I mean, like as you say, time is such an important factor with this because people can be really performative. I mean, we're all performative to some extent, and I think when it comes to relationships, those earlier months, or the level of performative action that happens in there, tends to lead to people quickly connecting and then sharing lives without truly seeing what's beneath the mask for a lot of people. And you get 3 to 6 months into a relationship and the mask starts to slip and the reality of the person starts to come to fruition. And then all of a sudden you're in it. And people do, like you say, they end up rushing so quickly into relationships to such a degree that then they feel that they can't back out. And there's this, it's sunk cost fallacy where they've invested so much so quickly. They think, well, I don't want to pull out. I want to make sure I keep investing into this relationship because I think it's got something. At which point, there's a danger to that because if they've not truly seen the person that they're doing that to and even with, then it can become so damaging. And I think with the turning of relationships where online dating and the belief that the next one will be the right one, I'll just keep trying. And I read somewhere before it was a wonderful thing that you can only withstand sort of between 3 to 5 serious relationships in a lifetime. So you think if you're powering through that, the psyche's not going to manage 5, 6, 3 year relationships. into that, all of a sudden you're going to have such an
Mm-hmm.
experience that's so fractured that your ability to trust love and trust somebody else is going to be, very hard to work through. I mean, everything is possible to work through, but I think when we look at it from this perspective, understanding where we sit with connection and what we can accept in our life, I think it really does require time. And I'm always kicking myself for saying X amount of times I've sort of said that it can happen pretty quick, which it can. There are again situations where the connection hits on so many levels that it is amazing. And this is not to say that the storybook love is non-existent, because it absolutely can be. But I do believe that timing and connection is the big point in there, with how vulnerable is somebody being, because is it manicured or is it genuine, and are they actually opening up the parts of themselves which they would otherwise hold because they're afraid of it being seen. Because it's in seeing how somebody deals with conflict is the biggest indicator whether or not a relationship's going to work. And that's not to say you can't have conflict. I think conflict's imperative, but if you have rupture within a relationship and you can't repair it, and that keeps happening, then it's going to chip away and the relationship won't work out. But if somebody can meet conflict and repair through communication, it's a good indicator that whatever you face can get worked on and worked through.
You used the word unmasked earlier.
Yeah.
Is there a timeline for when one is finally unmasked? What is that time period?
Oh, it's a good question. And I'm going to give the worst answer for this. No, I don't think there is a set timeline for it. I think there are indicators within, it's hard to hide yourself completely if you look at the first year with somebody, you have to see them. And actually, it was my partner that said, mum said to her once, that you have to see someone through every season to be able to get a good indicator of who they are. And I think there's truth in that. I'd read in a research paper, 3 months of solid contact with somebody will show sides to somebody that will exhibit behaviors and patterns which can be potentially damaging to relationships. But oftentimes we still won't look. We won't look at that because we don't want to, especially in the period where it's the honeymoon phase and things are great and intimacy is firing and everything is wonderful. The last thing we want to do is look for these indicators that something could be potentially harmful. Because if you're going into it with that mindset as well, that level of
Totally.
apprehension, yeah, it's going to create it. However, I think on the question that you've asked, I think the important thing is recognizing the other person's parts. And I mean this from the sense of how I practice is when we look at parts work, we're looking at specific parts of somebody that show up in certain environments. So let's say, when we argue, this is my response to something, I will do this, I'll shut down, or I'll do that. Okay, so that part of you, where does that originate from? Okay, when I was a child, this happened, and this is why this is created, and that defense mechanism is coming into play in this argument, these types of arguments. Right, okay. Can we sit with this? Can we work through this? Yes. Now, that's one mask that can be unmasked and looked at. But we have many. It's not just one overarching mask. This is a many face being that we have to work through, and we have to decide whether we can love every mask and every part underneath the mask, because it's not just one.
Sometimes the words, I feel like mask and red flags can get a little, synonymous. Are
Mm.
there red flags in a relationship that are just absolute non-starters? I think you used the word how people react, or you were describing how people react in an argument. It's so true. Like, if you guys can't have a tough conversation, I mean, that is really hard to get over. Are there other things like that that people really need to realize, wow, this is a red flag that I need to really reevaluate this relationship?
Yeah, I think you're right as well. Like the use of terms like red flag nowadays are just such a go-to in situations that they're not warranted. And I think it's so
Totally.
damaging. It's so damaging. Like, and it drives me crazy to hear people when they sort of say, "Oh, he's got so many red flags." Like, we all do. I haven't met a single human being that isn't littered with red flags. It's just whether or not their red flags matches your red flags, and you can work well with them. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, yeah, you should bring out the parts of the person that you love the most, the real darker parts of them, you should be able to bring them out, because it's in that love that you have the strength then to work through them. If you exist in a relationship that doesn't have red flags, it means somebody's hiding something about themselves very, very well. Or, the version of them that you're meeting is not, it's not showing the full depths of them. But we all have a red flag, or many flags of different colors. I think it's a load of rubbish to sort of look at it from the sense of that's enough to not be with somebody. That's an internal decision that no one else can say. That's a subjective experience. Somebody else might be able to handle that. But I'm adamant there's plenty of people that could not handle or would not want to handle or live with somebody like me. But then there's someone that does. And this is it. Like, my extent of the things that I've been through is enough for people to say, oh, not for me. Whereas for somebody else, they're like, hey, look, I love that person. And I think it's important to recognize that it's what you're willing to accept, the love that you're willing to receive. I mean, yes, there are the big things. Like if there is generally if there's abuse, if there are things that are danger to somebody's autonomy and agency and their health, if your nervous system is wrecked every day by being with somebody because of what they create within you, yeah, okay, that's a pretty big sign that you're not in the right space for each other. But whether there is not a determining factor that person is just outrightly wrong for everybody. And I think when somebody says that they've got a red flag, what does that mean? They can't date somebody ever, because that's going to be a problem, because there'll be someone out there that has a nervous system that actually connects with them enough to say, hey, that's okay. I can work with this. I can hold space for this person while they do their work.
Yeah, it's like a pink flag to other people,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I know we are kind of getting at time here, Liam. This was truly an amazing conversation, grounding, challenging. You were so brutally honest. Thank you so much. Can you let the listeners know where they can find you and stay connected with your insights?
Yeah, so I've got a website at liamjwakefield.com, and I'm on social media. I haven't been as active as I'd like to be. I think I've been very busy in private practice this year. So I'm working on a book, so that's taken up most of my time, but I am looking forward to 2026, so sort of trying to get a little bit more active online, hence the podcasts, and, getting to speak to some amazing people, and that is yourself. And Instagram is probably the more active area. So again, it's Liam J. Wakefield. And that's about, for me online.
All right. Well, I will be looking for a signed copy sent my way in 2026. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much. And just once again, a final reminder to anybody that did listen to this particular episode. If you're in the US and you need support today, you can call or text 988 or contact SAMHSA at 1-800-985-5990. I need to reiterate this for everybody. You are not weak for struggling. You're a human and you're not alone. We're all here. And we've all experienced some level of just really low time. So Liam, thank you for sharing yours and what's now shaped your career and what you're doing in life. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me on. It's been a really wonderful time to sit and talk to you.
And I love to hear your comments. Follow me on Instagram at Kalie Nitchie and let me know what you thought of today's episode. Did you know that you can listen and watch Just Lookin Out? We just launched our YouTube channel at Just Lookin Out Podcast. And don't worry if you didn't get all of that. You can find all this info in the episode description, as well as a link to apply to be a guest. The Just Lookin Out podcast and content posted by Safe Her Studios, LLC, and Kalie Nitchie is presented solely for general information, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast or related sites or social media is at the user's own risk. It is not intended as a substitute for advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professionals' diagnosis or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical or mental health condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.